What is the future of poetry? When I was small, uh, in English or in mother tongue language, all languages, there are poetry. Some has poetry. When I read that poetry, then uh, I feel very good when uh, when I was reading that poetry. But after some time interval, when poetry goes to peak, then my interest would become uh, would be less because of my interests are gone from that poetry because the poetry are very large, and that in that poetry sentence are very big, so I can't I don't have I didn't have interest to read that. And now this situation is happening in now these situations are happening in all boys. but but when I was small, my teacher always used to tell me in that poetry a meaning of that poetry. When you have observed one thing, the poetry are small, but the meaning of that poetry are very big, because poetry are that way to express our feeling uh, in short word. This called poetry according to me. And poetry are written by a writer, the famous writer. Famous writers poetry are converted into now song, now our voice. And now in this generation our poetry, in this generation uh, boys and all children are all children are attract towards song, not a poetry. So there will not future of poetry, but poetry. When when we see backward, uh, before a generation, the poetry of that generation, the meaning of uh, importance of poetry on in that generation is very more than this generation. Because and the future of poetry is not so longer. So I think poetry is not still will longer not long no not will longer. Maybe now still this, from this situation, that poetry will the poet now this situation, no one can read, no one can want to read poetry. So our exception are always there. Some, I think some 50 above 50 years old people want to read a book, want to read any poetry. Now we know that we know that we we do not have interest to read any book. But now in this generation are in this generation, that gap is filled by audible app, like they that app produce that app reading that book at that way, um, in that way, and no one can read that book. And so no one can want to read that book when we have to one way to read that book. So the future of poetry is no longer. The future of poetry will stay on book. So I think future of poetry is no longer. So these are my view on this topic. I'll meet you in next day with new topic. Until then, stay happy, stay motivated.